Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today, we diving deep into one of the most legendary groups in history, King Arthur's Knights of the Round Table. We all know the stories of chivalry, quests for the Holy Grail, and epic battles. But what if I told you that the reality behind these legends is far more complex and surprising than you ever imagined? For centuries, we've pictured them as the ultimate symbols of honor and virtue. But the untold truth is that their story isn't just about gleaming armor and noble deeds. It's a tangled web of history, myth, political propaganda, and some seriously juicy drama. So, grab your metaphorical swords and shields, because we're about to separate fact from fiction and uncover the real story behind the Knights of the Round Table. First things first, let's address the big question. Did King Arthur and his knights even exist? The answer is complicated. Most historians agree that if Arthur was a real person, he was likely a Romano-British leader or warlord who fought against the Anglo-Saxon invaders around the 5th or 6th century. The earliest mentions of him, like in the 9th century history of the Britons, depict him as a successful military commander, a dux bellorum, or leader of battles, not a king. There's no mention of a round table, no Camelot, and definitely no Lancelot. These early accounts paint a picture of a grim, gritty warrior in a dark and violent age, a far cry from the majestic king we know from literature. The historical Arthur, if he existed, was probably less concerned with chivalric codes and more with sheer survival. So, where did the whole round table idea come from? This iconic piece of furniture makes its first appearance much later, in a 12th century poem by an Anglo-Norman writer named Wace. In his Roman de Brute, Wace introduces the table, explaining that Arthur had it made so that none of his barons, when seated for a feast, could claim to be more important than another. The round shape symbolized equality and unity among his best warriors. This was a brilliant literary invention. It transformed Arthur's war band into a fellowship, a brotherhood. But it's important to remember, this was a literary device, not a historical fact from Arthur's time. It reflected the courtly ideals of the 12th century, not the harsh realities of the 6th. The idea resonated so powerfully that it became central to the legend. Now, let's talk about the knights themselves. Names like Lancelot, Galahad, and Percival are famous, right? Well, most of them were also later additions to the story, created by French poets and writers centuries after Arthur's supposed lifetime. The most influential of these was Chrétien de Troyes in the late 12th century. He's the one who gave us Sir Lancelot, the greatest knight of all, and introduced the concept of courtly love, including Lancelot's affair with Queen Guinevere. This love triangle became the central drama of the Camelot court, a story of passion, betrayal, and heartbreak that ultimately leads to the downfall of the kingdom. So, the most famous Knight of the Round Table was a French invention designed to add a bit of romantic spice to the tale. And what about their famous quests, especially the quest for the Holy Grail? This element adds a deep spiritual dimension to the Arthurian legends, but it wasn't part of the original stories either. The Grail quest was introduced in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, weaving Christian mysticism into the Celtic and military origins of the myth. It was a way to Christianize these popular pagan-rooted tales. The quest served as a spiritual test for the knights. While Lancelot was the greatest warrior, his sins prevented him from achieving the Grail. Instead, it was his pure and holy son, Galahad, along with the equally virtuous Bors and Percival, who succeeded. This narrative arc was a powerful moral lesson. Worldly prowess and battlefield skill mean nothing without spiritual purity. So, if the Round Table, the most famous knights, and their quests were all literary inventions, what was the truth of this fellowship? The real truth is that the Knights of the Round Table were a reflection of the society that wrote about them. In the medieval period, these stories were more than just entertainment. They were a form of political and social commentary. For English kings, like Henry II and Edward I, associating themselves with King Arthur was a powerful propaganda tool. It legitimized their rule and connected them to a glorious, heroic past, even if that past was mostly fictional. Edward I even created his own round table and hosted tournaments to channel the spirit of Arthurian chivalry. The legends provided a blueprint for the ideal knight, brave, loyal, just, and courteous. They were a cultural touchstone, shaping the very concept of European chivalry and knighthood for centuries. But the stories also served as a warning. The eventual fall of Camelot and the death of Arthur is a key part of the legend. Why did it all go so wrong? The stories blame human weakness. Lancelot and Guinevere's affair shattered the trust at the heart of the Fellowship. Mordred's treachery exploited the cracks that were already forming. The knights, once united, were torn apart by jealousy, betrayal, and personal ambition. The tale of the Round Table is ultimately a tragedy. It shows that even the noblest of ideals and the greatest of kingdoms can be brought down from within by our own flaws. It has a timeless and powerful message about the fragility of unity and the consequences of our choices. Let's look at some of the lesser-known truths. For example, the number of knights. How many were there? The answer varies wildly depending on which story you read. Some texts suggest 12, like the Apostles. Others go up to 150, or even over 1,600. And their code of chivalry wasn't always so chivalrous. In some of the earlier tales, knights like Gawain can be hot-headed, vengeful, and downright brutal. The perfectly polished, courteous knight is a later, more romanticized version. The original characters were far more flawed, complex, and human. Sir Gawain, for instance, is often portrayed as a model of chivalry, but in the alliterative Morte Arthur, he's a ruthless warrior on a campaign of conquest. This complexity is what makes the characters so enduring. So, the Knights of the Round Table weren't a historical company of 6th century warriors. They were a literary phenomenon, a myth that grew and evolved over 1,000 years. They started as a gritty war leaders band, were transformed by French poets into romantic heroes, infused with Christian spirituality by monks, and used as political propaganda by kings. The untold truth is that the legend is a magnificent, ever-changing tapestry woven from threads of history, poetry, politics, and human drama. It tells us less about the historical 6th century and more about the values, fears, and aspirations of the Middle Ages. The real magic of the Knights of the Round Table isn't whether they actually existed. It's that they represent a timeless ideal, a fellowship dedicated to justice, equality, and making the world a better place. The story of their rise and fall continues to fascinate us because it speaks to our own hopes for a better society and our fears of our own human failings. The legend endures not because it's historically accurate, but because it's profoundly true in a literary and moral sense. It's a story that continues to inspire artists, writers, and dreamers to this day. What do you think is the most fascinating part of the legend? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this journey into myth and history, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more deep dives. See you next time.